When we're on maximum power, we have something in the region of 3,250 horsepower.
Using a microprocessor, giving full power until it gets to 125 miles per hour, which is set there on the clock.
We will serve over 16,000 sandwiches will go on trains and be sold to our customers.
British Rail is a company under siege. From outside, we hear of high fares, late, overcrowded, and slow trains. But locked into a largely Victorian network is a system trying to break out.
236, pass your message.
It's a system that straddles the nation. A system operated by a blend of technology and human effort. It is run on a managerial, technical, and political knife edge that often leads to trouble on the line. Perhaps this is the perfect transport system. It simply moves spare parts in and out of a store. Like a railway, it is a guided network. But unlike a railway, its silent robots are directed by wire and controlled by a central computer. This system operates unaffected by fog, staff shortages, furious passengers, or rush hours. Its owners, Leyland Duff, can operate it and develop it according to their business needs, making their decisions unhindered by government departments or meddling politicians. British Rail operates in a hostile world. It's a system striving to meet government targets to make profits, yet remain competitive in a ruthless transport market. Historian Corelli Barnett.
Well, this government in particular does not believe in state subsidies and state aid and state intervention. In that, it is really only going back to what was true in the 19th century, in the original heyday of British railways. But even other governments which do believe in state intervention, on the whole, starve British Rail of money. So what you've had in Britain is that the state has never really had a national view of the rail system and has not been prepared to put in long-term investment and backing, which is a complete contrast to Europe.
The editor of Railway Gazette, Richard Hope.
BR investment is rising now, it is coming up, but so much of that is simply a backlog, correcting investment that wasn't made in the 1970s and the early part of the 1980s. BR still has a long way to go to catch up with the kind of railway they have in France or in Germany.
Railways everywhere are in direct competition with two transport systems, roads and aircraft. Yet in Britain, where government is committed to not favouring any particular mode, railways are at a disadvantage. Technical editor of Modern Railways, Roger Ford.
I think that the government talk of not subsidising against other modes is totally fatuous, because who pays for the upkeep of the very lightly used roads in rural areas? Roads that have to be relayed, etc., and they're perhaps used by 2 Land Rovers and a tractor once a week. On the other hand, railways, to maintain them is considered to be a heavy load on the public purse. There isn't a level playing field. Investment is biased because of the fact that it's got to be investment from in the railway's own turnover. No one suggests that roads have to pay for the investment in the roads' depreciation. It's a very difficult situation and a totally artificial one which works against railways. The present government authorises investment, but it isn't in the form of a grant, it's merely letting BR spend the money that it can earn. So to spend more money, BR has to earn more money, and to earn more money it has to raise its prices, cut its costs. So therefore the person who eventually pays is the customer.
So what is a railway? This is the permanent way. The rails, still known as roads, are the very basis of the system. Their structure governs everything: comfort, speed, and even the type of trains that can run. Intercity Performance Manager Bob Clark.
The track structure is made up of the rail, the sleeper, the ballast, and the clips that hold the rail to the sleeper. A modern railway track is essentially a carbon steel rail, which weighs 130 pounds a yard. There's a resilient pad which cushions the effect of the rail on the sleeper. The sleepers, modern sleeper, is a pre-stressed concrete sleeper, which weighs around 1/3 of a tonne, and that sits in granite ballast, usually 12 to 15 inches deep, depending on the category of the railway. The main purpose of having the ballast there is to provide support for the track. It enables the geometry of the track to be maintained, and it provides a free drainage medium for getting water away from the railway. Take, for example, a mainline route like the East Coast Main Line. We would expect the rail to be lasting something like 20 years before it starts to get tired. We would expect the rail pads to be lasting between 5 and 10 years. We would expect the sleepers to last 50 years at least, the modern concrete sleepers, that is. The ballast we would clean about every 15 years. But at that point, it's still serviceable for lower category lines, and the policy that we have now is to transfer the material at approximately those expiry dates down to a lower category line where they can still be serviceable for many more years with lower speed and lower tonnage traffic.
The trains that run on the rails are the point of contact between customer and system, a system that doesn't always seem to run in the passenger's favour. Because to British Rail, the system belongs to one of 4 business sectors created to give management a focused commercial approach: Intercity, Network Southeast, Rail Freight, and Provincial, now called regional railways. Sectorization means 4 separate networks or companies running on one system. Business editor of the London Evening Standard, Mike Smith.
The difficulty with sectorisation is that it once again places the emphasis on short-term profit, whereas you are trying to provide a long-term public service. The corporate plan, renegotiating the terms of the corporate plan, has placed the emphasis on short-term or made that emphasis even greater.
On the whole, it's been a very good thing for BR. It's introduced financial discipline, and it's introduced better management, more power for the commercial side of the railway to get what they want from the engineers and the operators. The problem arises when it's taken too far and there is no overall corporate control at the boundaries between the sectors. And I think the classic example here is timetabling and connections between Intercity and Provincial. Intercity is just going its own way, and Provincial is having serious problems in trying to adjust their timetables to make connections, and very often when they do make connections, if the Provincial train is running late, Intercity won't wait for it. That the travelling public who don't understand these subtleties find this very difficult to cope with and very difficult to accept.
This is not part of British Rail, but it does conform to most of the criteria now seen as essential for efficient railway operation. It responded to a market need, the need to provide a link between Docklands and London's tube network. The Docklands Light Railway is a competitive solution, and like the wire-guided spare parts system, it is completely automatic. There are no drivers. Customer Services Manager Mike Ambrose.
The railway feeds off a 750-volt third rail, which is the grey conductor rail you can see. We have 11 trains, and 9 trains run during the peak times. Also, at each station there is a brown box in the middle of the forefoot, which is called a docking data link. Once the trains pass over this docking data link, it identifies the train at the station and also gives data regarding what speed the train should go to the next station. Also, there are speed monitor loops along the 7.5-mile route of the railway. That's the black wire, which loops off at certain distances. There is a timer on board the train So the train must meet one of those loops within a second. If it meets it over a second, basically the train's going too slow. If it meets it under a second, the train's going too fast, and that's how the railways run.
Although only 3 years old, the Dockland system has already outgrown itself. To cope, the lines and stations are being extended, and a more sophisticated signalling system is to be introduced. Director Jim Gates.
The present system was fine for the initial railway, which was to run 9 trains around the system. In the future, we'll be running about 30 trains around the system. They'll be that much closer together. We have a central junction within our system where trains converge into the same route. That is very difficult to manage in signalling and control terms. And the system we're going to, which will be the first of its type in the UK, but it has been applied elsewhere, will, rather than having fixed blocks, keeping trains apart, it has a moving block. So in fact it keeps a predetermined distance between trains depending on what speed they're going.
When they built this railway, there was £77 million. And they said, what can we have? They went out to tender, and at one time they were thinking of trams down the Whitechapel Road. But what they got was this superb little railway, fully automatic, very well used. Of the 77 million, only about 10 or 12 actually went into the trains and the signalling. Most of it went onto the property. But because it was a case of not buying a railway, but buying 77 million quid's worth of railway, I think it was the first railway that exceeded its specified loads on the second day after opening. And as a result, everybody's had to work very hard to expand it, which is a pity, because when an automatic railway runs, it runs extremely well. But when you are trying to rebuild a railway, when you're trying to increase its capacity 3 times, threefold, when you're trying to extend it to run into the city, you are mucking about with the automated system. Reliability goes.
What is needed is a much more of an integrated plan, so we know where we're going to be, what we're actually providing transport for, say in 10 years' time. So we're not working in the dark, we're not continually having to upgrade different bits of the system at different times, that we are going forward with an integrated approach, so that we've got a across-the-board standard, if you like, of reliability and flexibility and quality of service to passengers at the end.
Like British Rail, Docklands has suffered from a lack of long-term planning vision. The custom-built 7.5-mile tramway system is fine for a light, self-contained railway. But its computer technology could never cope with British Rail, a system of over 23,500 miles, running trains of every shape, speed and length. Signalling governs the speed and the number of trains that can be run on any piece of track. More sophisticated signals improve the efficiency of the entire system.
That's you, Arthur? There's a cow on the line between your box and mine.
Wow, I've got the Lakes Express on the line.
Victorian technology relied on interlocking levers and men.
Oi! There's a cow on the line. Keep a sharp lookout. Right.
Today, signalmen scan VDUs in central control rooms commanding hundreds of miles of main line. Out on the track, this modern mainline signal looks like a simple traffic light, but it's not. As the train passes, it changes to red, commanding any following trains to stop. When showing one yellow light, it means stop at the next signal, which is red. 2 yellows means the next signal has 1 yellow, so be prepared to apply the brakes. The driver sees the signal and gets an audible warning. If he fails to press a cancel button after a warning of a red or yellow signal ahead, the train will automatically brake. This system, called AWS Advanced Warning System, is activated by magnets on the track. it has made the British railway carriage statistically one of the safest places on Earth. But the signals and AWS only advise the driver. He remains in control. Its weakness is that the driver can cancel the system and still pass a red signal. To prevent this, British Rail is now developing new signal technology, ATP, Automatic Train Protection. Project manager Bob Walters.
The attractions of the system that we are contemplating adopting and which we are piloting currently is that it works in parallel with the existing signalling and can therefore be installed without alteration to the existing signalling, the reinvestment in which would represent billions of pounds. This provides the additional safety without having to replace or rip out any of the existing signalling and can therefore be introduced at a far quicker rate than would otherwise be the case.
With automatic train protection, an onboard computer advises the driver. If he is not matching the computer's model of events, unlike AWS, the computer takes control and applies the brakes. Instruments like this will be in the cab. This tells the driver what's going on. The white pointer is a speedometer. The green light shows the maximum speed limit on the track, 60 miles per hour, and the red display shows the target speed for the train. In this case, 0. In other words, stop. With ATP, the driver cannot pass this red signal. That power is removed from him. Part of the reason for the development of automatic train protection is that British Rail has been haunted by 3 accidents: Clapham, Purley and Belgrove. Drivers' experience has always enabled them to interpret the line. In the case of Purley and Belgrove, driver misinterpretation is what led to the crashes. Automatic train protection would have prevented them. But ironically, it was the Clapham accident inquiry which recommended adopting ATP, even though Clapham was caused by faulty workmanship. Suddenly, ATP became a priority, and the politicians rushed to reassure the public.
I think that to have ATP is in itself quite a desirable thing. Many of the other European railways are now moving towards ATP. It is part of the modern railway. But those railways are maintained by government as essentially as public services, and in that context it is quite feasible for the governments to insist on very high safety standards. Where it goes wrong is if you demand higher and higher safety standards, where more and more money is spent for less and less return, where you demand that from a railway which is going to have to shed business, is going to have to put traffic from the railway onto the road because it can't balance its books, then the whole thing becomes not merely ridiculous but self-defeating.
The problem is that to impose it as a political will, when in fact the number of accidents it would prevent is minimal, is quite irrational. BR is going to have to find another £1 billion to pay for this, and that could be a conservative estimate. The numbers rise every time you talk and think about it. But where is that £1 billion going to come from? I suspect it's going to have to spin the money out of its own guts as before in many instances. Whether the government will make that money available is, I think, very doubtful. So basically, the customer will end up paying for their own safety benefits, and they're very minor safety benefits at that.
This racing driver is attempting to shave 1/100th of a second off each lap by braking at the last possible moment and accelerating to maximum speed as quickly as possible without losing grip. The secret is driving smoothly. High-speed trains employ the same technique, but save minutes rather than seconds. This is British Rail's new 140 miles an hour locomotive, Class 91. It's not the driver, but a microprocessor that maintains grip. Traction Inspector Gordon Linford.
Speed now 107.
The racing car weighs less than a Mini. The train, 375 tons. It has reached 125 miles per hour at full power in just under 2.5 minutes.
You can already feel the power starting to decrease on the 91. She's getting gradually up to the 125 mark. There we are. The actual power line still remains lit, but the microprocessor has already eliminated any power to the traction motor. In fact, there is a residual amount of power to the motor to keep it at that constant speed the driver has selected.
The microprocessor has accelerated the 91 without wheel slip. The faster trains accelerate to top speed and the quicker they stop, the more you can get on the line. The more on the line, the more money British Rail makes. So, if signals can automatically stop the train and microprocessors pilot it, why not, like Docklands, remove the driver and let technology take over? Intercity 225 project engineer Andrew Higton.
In engineering terms, it's not difficult. It's possible, that's been shown. But in terms of a high-speed railway like this, I don't think I would like to ride on a train doing 140 miles an hour with no driver, just as I don't think if I was on an aeroplane I'd like to travel without a pilot, although it's perfectly feasible to take off, fly and land an aeroplane without a pilot.
Public safety perceptions are changing so radically. You only have to see the fuss about aircraft safety with these computer systems. I would have thought that it was not on.
Intercity have built Class 91 and its train for a specific market, London Leeds Edinburgh. Its development is an example of how the creation of business sectors has focused commercial effort. But this process has caused casualties. Speedlink is a subsector of rail freight. It's a system common in Europe. Wagons collected from private industrial sidings are marshalled into one long train, like this, for the rest of their journey. But it loses money and might be closed.
Any reduction in freight on the railways will inevitably move that freight onto the roads. And one estimate is that cutting back this little bit of Speedlink will put an extra 3 million tonnes of freight a year back onto the roads. Environmentally, that's crazy.
British Rail has a problem. Speedlink will be essential when the Channel Tunnel opens, because customers can pack their own wagons knowing they will reach their destination on time and safe. But British Rail can't afford the small locomotives to move or trip the private wagons to the main yards, where big locomotives take over. It costs money trying to use big engines like this to pull short trains while tripping. And it now seems likely that the Speedlink system will be abandoned a mere 3 years before the tunnel opens.
On the freight side, BR is relying very heavily on private industry, wagon hire companies and private transport companies to invest in terminals and in wagons. And they've just dealt, or in the process of dealing, a very damaging blow to the confidence of those people by withdrawing the Speedlink wagon load service and rendering a lot of past investment by these same companies useless and worthless. And I can't see how they're going to persuade people to invest to the extent forecast in Channel Tunnel traffic.
Ironically, rail freight's Channel Tunnel subsector is already investing in wagons, some from France. Rail freight's Bert Blissett.
We are leasing some of these wagons to operate, firstly, a high-performance service within Britain, and with day one of the tunnel, to operate a service between the continental mainland and Britain, having the same characteristics of speed and carrying capacity. This wagon combines the two features of a low platform height and a very high speed capability. In this instance, 140 kilometers per hour, which is roughly 90 miles per hour. There is a souped-up version of the wagon capable of 100 miles per hour, and trains formed of these wagons run every night between Avignon, Paris, Avignon, Lille, and so on, which makes them the fastest freight trains in the world. The speed gives us two things. Firstly, the ability to compete with road haulage in the marketplace over certain key routes where speed really is of the essence. The ability, for example, to get from Paris and Frankfurt to London overnight. And secondly, it enables us to path freight trains between passenger trains, which themselves are running even faster. A freight train of conventional speed, say 60 miles an hour, is much more difficult to path, as we call it, between passenger trains which are running at 125.
So railways only work when everything is taken into account. Fast trains can't work safely without a signalling system to match. Freight has special needs and yet must interlock with the fastest passenger timetables. When Britain is linked to the European system, the efficiency of the entire system will depend on the quality of our rail infrastructure. But European trains, freight and passenger, will emerge from the tunnel onto the most archaic lines in Britain.
The Channel Tunnel, it seems to me, will only have the effects on British Rail that British Rail itself and the government and British public opinion allow it to have. In other words, it's not so much the tunnel, it is the constraints on rail development in Britain which will determine what British Rail can do.
It's true that about £1 billion is being spent on a passenger terminal at Waterloo, on trains, and on some limited improvements to the railway between London and the tunnel. But they are very limited improvements. They really don't amount to any more than bringing that line up to a standard which is lower than the standard of equivalent intercity lines north and west of London.
We're looking at Channel Tunnel development through the wrong end of the telescope, or you could say the wrong end of the tunnel, in my view. We're looking at it purely on the short-term commercial profit. If you look at what's happening in France, I think in the next 4 or 5 years they're going to spend £4 billion on improving an already very, very good high-speed rail network. We are still haggling about 73 miles of high-speed network.
The spectre that haunts British politics is of domination by the Europeans. Railways, for years the British symbol of inefficiency and poor quality, are now seen as environmentally, economically and socially an essential part of a greater Europe. Political opinion in Britain has yet to catch up.
High-speed rail link is way in the future. All the traffic demands indicate that extra capacity will be needed in the southeast. We understand that, but where it runs, when it's opened, is a matter for debate, for decision and announcement shortly.
But the pressure and feeling from Europe seems to be that we're being slow off the mark and it will be needed much earlier than that.
Well, we're running this rail network, not the Europeans.
It comes every day. I just can't guarantee when. It's a temperamental ghost. You're not the Headless Baron.
No, I'm from Barclays. I think I may be able to help.
Yes, I think you might.
You see, with an unreliable ghost, it may be better to offer weekend breaks rather than hourly visits. And with a flexible loan, you could develop accommodation and even catering.
Let's discuss this in my office.
If you're running a small business or thinking of starting one, talk to Barclays.
Sellotape original. With end finder. Take one. Stand by. Tape running. And cut. And again. Okay, it's a wrap.
Only Sellotape Original comes with a unique end finder.
Oh, yes, it's definitely the 6-amp fuse shorting through the alternator, unless, of course, we've got a dodgy earth causing the polarity reversal.
Did Dad remember to join the AA this year? No, but I know a woman who did.
Now you can join the AA from the comfort of your own home. Just ring 0800 91 9595. The AA. We're all you need to know.
With Air UK, you get a choice of 7 flights a day from Gatwick to both Glasgow and Edinburgh, and 7 flights back. It could be just the lift your business needs. Air UK, where business takes off.
I wouldn't do that if I were you, Rupert.
If the wind changes, you'll stay like it.
Well, I'd get rid of him, love. You hang on to him, he's all right.
I think you should make a nice cup of tea.
It seems that everyone in the world has plenty of advice to give.
Take the money away for the box. 19 pounds. She's going to take the money. Oh!
The question is, which is the right advice? And where can you go to get it?
Oh, no, please, there's something in my eye.
Try pulling your eyelid down as far as it'll go.
And then blowing your nose. I wouldn't pull that trigger if I were you.
At the Halifax, we've probably given more advice on mortgages than any other lender. With all that experience and our wide range of plans and options, we believe we can give you the best advice on your mortgage.
Try pulling your eyelid down as far as it'll go.
Then blowing your nose.
The Halifax, for mortgage advice you can bank on. For those who like their tea to taste like tea, finding the word decaffeinated might be somewhat disconcerting. But when you gently decaffeinate your tea within hours of picking it, then getting a modern cup of tea to taste like a proper one...
Look, silly. Lions.
Well, it isn't hard to swallow at all. Lions decaffeinated tea. Keep the flavor, keep the taste.
Now you know to what degree BMW test their paintwork. The BMW 3 Series, from £12,500 to 160 Celsius.
London is a kind of railway blood clot between our industrial heartlands and Europe. London's rails were never intended to, and probably never will, offer a clear way to Europe. It's the largest commuter system in the world, but it also needs investment to keep its customers, without which they too might find European cities more attractive. Director of Network Southeast, Chris Green.
I think I would invest in more railway infrastructure in the central London area. It's obviously going to be the bottleneck to all future transport development in London. And if we're not careful, it will eventually drive people out of London into areas like Paris and Frankfurt if it becomes too difficult to get into London.
Most European cities have purpose-built lines under their centres. London, Europe's largest city, has one. A once-forgotten freight tunnel. The tunnel has been reopened and called Thameslink. The new trains can run from Bedford to Brighton through London's heart.
What we really want to do is, A, to expand Thameslink into a real metro, and that means new viaducts, new flyovers, and a train every 3 minutes in the rush hour. But I think more important for London, we want to go for the big east-west crossrail, and that, I think, is really hitting the top prize. This would give us an express railway across London from Paddington to Liverpool Street. We could move 48,000 people an hour extra.
Journalists Richard Hope and Roger Ford.
I think the real problem for Network Southeast is that they don't have a remit to, if I can put it that way, to make life in London more civilised. They don't have the kind of remit that the Dutch Railways has to quite definitely carry more passengers, to increase the number of people who are moving by rail, specifically to reduce road congestion. There isn't a link there in this country, and that link is very necessary to make sure that Network Southeast knows what it's doing, knows where it's going, and it should be guiding Network Southeast fares policy, and it isn't.
A guide to the success of a railway is the number of customers carried in comfort. Bottlenecks will limit this capacity. This is one of the worst. For over 100 years, Borough Market Junction, outside London Bridge, has reduced travel to a crawl. Solutions are not new. British Rail's Roger Brazier.
We do have a report here made on behalf of the South Eastern Railway, the former private company that owned the railway behind us here, by John Wolfe Barry and A.J. Barry, who are consulting engineers, and this is dated 1894. and it contains a number of alternative schemes for trying to do just what we are still trying to do, which is get the trains through this bottleneck rather easier and better and quicker. And in fact, if you open it up, one perhaps of the most fascinating is this one here, where the other side of London Bridge, in order to sort the traffic out as it approached London Bridge Station, which was part of the problem, they were going to double-deck the viaduct down in where the old Spa Road station used to be, down towards Southwark Park.
But at last, relief is at hand. Planning Manager Richard Mallins.
Well, in the background here, you have the double-track viaduct spanning the Borough Market, which carries the service into Charing Cross. And what we need to do is provide an additional pair of tracks over this section, which means repeating what the Victorians did, which is to put a viaduct over the market, which you see behind us here. And that would allow us to run both Thameslink and Charing Cross trains over this section in the peak hours. We estimate that some 15,000 people would use the new link that would be created between London Bridge, the City and King's Cross during the morning peak 3 hours. So that's a substantial benefit and a significant relief to congestion, particularly on the Northern Line, which provides the alternative route on the Underground.
On the trains, it's technology to the rescue. Frustrated commuters will get more elbow room with a new generation, networker.
Under the government's financial rules, BR couldn't justify new trains to increase capacity. It was only through new technology in the form of three-phase drives, which recover energy when you brake, that BR was actually able to go ahead with a capacity expansion. Now, in a system where you depend on new technology to provide more capacity, because the financial rules won't let you do it with old capacity, I would just have thought that suggests that they're not being allowed to address the future in a logical way.
Lucky to get a seat, networker project director Jim Vine.
We have a severe overcrowding problem on our lines into Cannon Street and Charing Cross at the moment. And many of our trains, up to about 50% of them, are well overloaded beyond any agreed limits with the Department of Transport. Either we had to provide a considerable amount of new infrastructure, like widening and putting more tracks on existing viaducts in central London and rebuilding terminals like Charing Cross, where there isn't the land available, or we could go for lengthening trains. The most cost-effective way was to extend the present 10-car trains to 12-car trains. Even that is involving, of course, about £150 million worth of expenditure on the infrastructure.
Now, we've ordered 400 vehicles, and there was an option for another 276 to be exercised last February. Now it won't be exercised before the end of this year. All the time, investment plans that have been announced slide back. The reason they slide back is because of short-term financial pressures overriding the long-term interests of the railway.
Being a bulk people mover has a downside. Empty trains in sidings not earning during the day. Network South East has vigorously marketed leisure travel to keep these trains busy and cut losses with the extra revenue. Government demands the sector must eventually run without subsidy, but the downturn in the economy has reduced off-peak travel. So who will pay? Journalist Mike Smith.
I think there's no question that the customer will be paying an increasing amount in railway fares. I think it's pretty obvious where the cutbacks in taxpayer support will come from. It will come directly from the customer's pocket.
With the exception of major railway construction under central London, if that takes place, it's the passenger who's going to pay for the future of the railways. That is the government's policy, to cut down continuously the amount of public money going in and make the customer pay.
Unlike Network South East, on this railway, there is no rush hour, no passengers, and no bottlenecks. This train carries nothing but coal. Called merry-go-round, it's a system for the continuous flow of coal from mine to power station. The train is just a system for moving it. It's what railways were invented for. Rail freight's coal subsector is in direct competition with low-cost road haulage. To survive in this market, Nottingley Depot in Yorkshire, like others in the sector, is dedicated totally to the system. Its staff, locomotives and wagons do nothing else. Area manager Eric Straw.
Basically, we carry 1,116 tonnes in each train, which incidentally is 45 lorry loads of 38.5 tonne lorries with one guy, as opposed to 45 lorry drivers. And we move the coal over 5 days a week and also Sunday night to the customer's requirements. The customer advises us each week in respect of the tonnage that he wants for the following week. We get that advice at 1600 on a Wednesday. We formulate a train plan employing 116 drivers, 44 train preparers, 17 locomotives and wagon sets to meet that train plan. Presently we're moving 350,000 tonnes in a week, but we can move up to 500,000 tonnes per week.
Nottingley's merry-go-round system is virtually a private company. This is a private company. Foster Yeoman quarry stone and sell it in bulk. Rail is a cheap and reliable way of moving it to the marketplace. As a private enterprise, they were able to buy the best solution to suit their needs. Their own trucks and American-built locomotives. Rail freight provide the drivers and track. Foster Yeoman could only make this long-term investment because they knew that their connection with the main rail system would always be there. Other companies are not so sure.
I think there's a great deal more that could be done to get the private sector involved with not only owning wagons but owning locomotives. I don't see why the private sector shouldn't ultimately be able to crew its own trains under licence by BR. But to do that, they must have some kind of statutory right of access to the rail network. They must have guarantees that that rail network is going to be there for them to use over a reasonable period of time, in exactly the same way as somebody who buys a lorry or builds a factory assumes that the road network is going to be there and he's not going to find himself cut off. Railways require a great deal of commitment, a great deal of investment on a very long-term basis. You expect to get it back over 30 or 40 years. And there is, without the guarantees that the railway network, the lines are going to be there, that the policies that will be putting traffic towards the railways are there, that the financial underpinning will be there. Without that, people are not prepared to put money into the railways.
Foster Yeoman's long-term commitment to rail gives them a sharp insight into how British Rail runs. Director Richard Painter.
I think the prime difficulty with British Rail at the moment is they have to react to circumstances, and that goes all the way down to the system. With us, we've found that if we can get specialised drivers, dedicated maintenance people, the right equipment, it is a very, very effective transport system, probably the most effective in the country. But in order to get people to be proactive rather than reactive, I would want to have a lot more freedom and be a lot more decisive in my economic planning.
This is the result of proactive planning. Backed by British Rail's biggest subsidy, Provincial, now known as Regional Railways, has restored customer faith in railway travel by selling hard and re-equipping. It hasn't been easy. These early attempts at a quick fix, known as skippers and pacers, basically bus bodies on goods wagon chassis, proved unreliable. Marketing manager Paul Prescott.
The Pacer was the best vehicle around, and it was also very important politically for us to be able to build up confidence with the Department of Transport that there was a future for provincial lines, that they could be operated in a low-cost way, that we could attract people to travel on them if only we had new equipment, and they were extremely valuable in that sense. We then having laid that framework, we're able to go on to expand with more attractive trains in the Sprinter.
This is the most attractive train, the top-of-the-range Express, the final component in the sector's business plans. But manufacturing delays of Express at the now privatized British Rail Engineering, BREL, means tight government financial targets to reduce taxpayer support could be missed.
Provincial is not going to be able to meet the targets that have been set out in the corporate plan and agreed with government, or at least not without drastic cuts in services and maybe closing some lines. I think myself the government will draw back from such drastic action, particularly if there's an election approaching. But the fact that they are 200 or 300 coaches short simply cannot be overcome without spending more money, and that money has to be spent on keeping coaches in service that would have been scrapped.
It's even worse than that, because the coaches that they're short of are the top of the range. They've introduced the new diesel trains in reverse order. They introduced the simplest and cheapest. They've gradually upgraded. With the Sprinter Express, they produced a very attractive mid-range train, which pulled in ridership gains of 40–50% on some lines. The trains that they haven't got are the air-conditioned 100-mile-an-hour Premier trains. So not only are they suffering from lack of capacity, they haven't got the trains which would have really pulled in the passengers. So they've got a severe revenue loss through not offering the better service.
Britain has some of the fastest trains in Europe. Intercity is now a widely copied idea. We also have some of the worst. Travel into the capital is a national disgrace and might even force business to other European cities. The bald facts are that British Rail moves people on over 700 million journeys a year. British trains travel 265 million miles each year. They carry over 143 million tons of freight. British Rail employs 134,361 men and women. Here, at the Department of Transport, 2,300 people care for roads. 135 deal with trains. To whom is British Rail accountable?
It's not accountable at all, really, if you exclude the Department of Transport, who are the sponsoring department. Beyond that, the customer has no real say about whether he has a complaint about whether his trains are late, or whether his fares are too high, or whether the rolling stock is of no value to him. It's basically unaccountable to the customer. It might be accountable to the Secretary of State for Transport, but that's done in private.
I think the present arrangement whereby BR has to agree in advance, privately with the civil servants, what proposals should be put on the minister's desk so he can sign them with a great flourish and claim the credit, I think that is totally wrong. It prevents BR from, as they should, from stating publicly what they would like to do, setting out an agenda for investment, telling the public and the government what the implications are of doing it and not doing it, and it allows government to evade the responsibility for blocking investment, for stopping investment in certain areas, and then turn around and say that the railways, 2 or 3 years later, say the railways aren't performing.
Is it a level playing field? Well, this bridge is perhaps a monument to the difficulties facing the railways. The d.o.o Road Bridge in the Scottish Highlands is being built as a shortcut across the Firth. Building it to carry the railway too would have saved over 20 miles.
The d.o.o Bridge story is a classic example of the extraordinary imbalance there is between road and rail investment criteria in this country. Here we had the A9 road running parallel with the Far North Line from Inverness up to Wick, having enormous sums of money spent on it, more than could possibly be justified in strictly economic criteria. It was a political move. The parallel railway could have been brought up to the same standard by constructing the d.o.o link, and given a viable future, the cost was not all that excessive. There was money available from Europe if the government had chosen to take it, but instead they secretly told British Rail to play down and to withdraw the application. BR went along with this and announced that they didn't wish to go ahead with it, and therefore the future of that line is now seriously in doubt.
Well, it doesn't show anybody up in a particularly good light. British Rail promoted it very heavily. I remember one area manager there saying without the d.o.o Bridge the line to the north is doomed. The sums concerned, the bridge was under 15 million, the A9 investment is hundreds of millions. And yet BR is now saying it doesn't matter and the surface is perfectly fine. It's a sad business, and I think it shows the way in which BR is unable to actually fight a project through for fear of offending the government and the civil service.
We do seem to make it very difficult for ourselves. I think that the answer is in some way to disengage British Rail a bit more from the Department of Transport and give it its own financial targets, which are much more realistic from the broader social need.
Historian Corelli Barnett.
It seems to me the advantage of privatisation, if it were real privatisation, that is to say really freeing the railways to operate in the market, would be that it would get the Department of Transport off the railways' back. And instead of having this absurd demand that they should make an 8% or whatever it is return on their investment, that the railways would then be free to go for investment on terms that seem good to them and their lenders.
Technology is on its side, the environment is on its side. The problem is that it is not seen as an opportunity. The railways in this country are always seen as a problem to be managed to limit losses. I suspect it goes back to the fact that our railways were built for profit, whereas European railways were built for national interest and defence in particular. Therefore, railways in this country are seen purely in commercial terms, rather than their much wider capability as a tool of social improvement.
Provided the Channel Tunnel does come, that, I think, above all, will open the eyes of people to what railways are all about in a European context and will change the rules of the game.
I think if we continue with the current policies, we will only get a smaller, more elitist and certainly more expensive railway. The railways are very much at the crossroads in the next few years as to which way they're going to go, and particularly the size of the railways that we will have in the future.